To try to finish up, I want to finish up hashing and the kind of questions that I could ask you regarding hashing. Before I do that, I'm going to talk about a couple of techniques that you can use for hashing to improve it or to change the behavior of it. One of them is called bucketing, and the other one is called double hashing. So I go with double hashing first, it's easier. So double hashing basically means that if you try to, let's say you're trying to store a record, and you put it through the hash function. So the hash function says put it into this index, into this location. If that location is not available, what we can do is we can say, okay, that will be a collision, so we'll take the record again, and we'll go through another hashing function. And maybe the second hashing function will give us a spot that's available. So in the event of a collision, we try to use a secondary hashing function. There's no guarantee that the second hashing function will be successful, but at least has a chance to be successful, where the first one definitely had a collision. That's called double hashing. Of course, even if you're successful in a second hash, you could be going into a slot that's going to collide with somebody on their first hashing function. So it's not a simple solution. The best idea is try to minimize collisions as much as possible.
If there is a collision in second hashing as well?
Then you have to resolve the collision somehow. Linear probing, quadratic probing. Another typical solution to a colliding is a very simple one. It's called overflow area. Overflow area is, so here's your hash table, and so what happens anytime you have a collision, you go to a totally different part, maybe a different array or different file area, and what you're going to do is you're basically going to have a linear storage of all records that collided. So in that case, if you collide on a storage, you go to the end of this file, you append it to this file, and then when you search for it, you won't find it. You'll either find the wrong key or a tombstone. And then you'll go to the overflow area, and you'll have to linearly search that area, which is inefficient. It's not efficient, but it's one technique. So you could do hashing, double hashing, and then overflow area, or hashing, double hashing, linear probing. Somehow you have to make some type of a resolution. Scott?
Is that bucketing?
No, bucketing I'm going to talk about.
Oh, okay.
So bucketing is an interesting idea. Bucketing is an interesting idea. What?
I didn't even...
Oh yeah, because you were busy on the phone. You're busy saying, do I need to pick up some milk, honey? Is that for me? Yes. Now I have 2 bottles of water. Thank you so much. You're wonderful. That's okay. I will just explode. Thank you. And the first one, save the second one for dessert. Okay, let's talk about bucketing, because bucketing is also a very popular technique, and it's a very good type of technique that I can ask you some interesting statistical questions and behavior questions. Typically, the idea of bucketing is that normally, if we're talking about a hash table, there are 2 basic ways of looking at a hash table. The first way of looking at a hash table is that a hash table is basically made out of slots, right? So a record will literally, if it hashes here, it's literally going to go into the slot. So we'll have space for the record there. Fine. So the other technique that we had is we did chaining. So that means if you hash to a particular chain, what happened is basically if the chain already had 1 record in it, and it didn't match your key, you would basically append over here, and so the chain now would have 2 records in it. So here with slots, we were very concerned about packing density. We tried to make the density kind of optimal balance, which gave us to what percentage of packing density? That's a little bit too little, because that's going to require so much more overhead for space. But let's say 60, 70, 80%. So 70% may be a good target area. So with slots, you need to have a packing density, let's say of 70% to have a reasonable amount of collisions and not too many. Okay, with chaining, you could have the number of chains equal to the number of records. You could actually have the number of chains fewer than the number of records. Right? Okay, so the third technique is bucketing. Bucketing works like this. So what happens is, instead of having, it's not chains, it's more like slots, except that rather, so for each bucket, we will have multiple slots. So a bucket will have multiple storage locations. So let's think about it this way. So suppose that I have, make it very simple, suppose I have 30 records, right? 30 records. And I decide to have 10 buckets with 3 slots per bucket. Can I fit all the records in there?
Yes.
Okay, is it a good idea?
No,
Probably no. No, it is not. Why not?
because the density is 100%.
Okay, so now, because we're going to be targeting now 10 buckets. Now, here's the situation with buckets. If a record says you should go to bucket I, it goes to bucket I. If a second record in the future says, okay, you need to go to bucket I, it can still go to bucket I because there's another slot in it. The third one says, you can go to bucket I. But the fourth one, you can't go to bucket I, it's full. So where do you go? Well, you can't put it into the next bucket because buckets are supposed to be holding homogeneous records that all hash the same location. So if you don't make it into a bucket, you're going to then have to go to overflow area. Right? Now, let's take a look at some of the interesting things that we did. Is this going to go? What's going on here? Oof. No, it seems to be doing something, except working. Maybe because it's too big. The interesting thing happens, if you think about it, we have to now think a little bit differently with buckets. So for example, if we decide that we are going to have n buckets and n records. So let's say we have a situation where the buckets, we're going to have n buckets and we're going to have 2 slots per bucket. So in that case, if that's the situation, then what's going to happen is we're going to have twice as much memory as we need. Because for each of the n buckets, you can only house 1 record in it, and so therefore, when all the records go in, you really have 2 n slots and n records, so half the hash table is going to be empty. Okay? So, but that's a situation that's modeled by this. So for example, if we model this, we can say if we have n buckets with 2 slots per bucket, then we can say that some of these buckets are going to have no records in them at all. And 36% of the buckets will have exactly 1 record. And then 18% will have 2 records. You are not going to have any problems until here. Because 2 of these records will go to a particular bucket. So how many records will actually at this point go to an overflow area?
1.
Well, 1 out of the 3 for each of them, and that's going to be about 6% of the records. So 6% of the records are going to be going to an overflow area. How about here? It's going to be 2 times 1.5%, so 3%, and then here you're going to have 3 times this, so it's going to be like almost about 3% or something like that. So the idea is if you can so what happens if, for example, if you reduce the number of buckets? So for example, instead of having n buckets, what if I have 80% of n buckets, but now I up the number of slots to 3. Then some interesting things can happen. The situation goes on here is that now we're going to have our R over N for our Poisson distribution is actually going to increase over 1. Because the number of records will be higher than the number of targeted locations. Does that make sense? So we'll get some different possible results. Okay, I just want to kind of say that so it's out there. So this is bucket. So you can do some interesting analysis of what may be a best performance. Okay, in terms of buckets, slots, chains, etc., etc., etc. Okay. All right. So let's go to the next topic. So next topic is actually kind of a related topic, but not really, but it is kind of a related, what happened here? Okay, that's fine. That's not what I want, that's not that. No wonder this slide looks perfect, it's not the one I want. Here's the one I want. So what we're going to look at here is something known as indexing and multi-level indexing. So indexing is a way to access files without having to access the file directly. But we want to find something that's in the file, but we don't want to look in the file. And the reason for that is because the file is going to be very, very large. Many, many things are going to be in the file. So rather than searching through a file, which takes a lot of time and a lot of processing, we might want to search through an index. Much like when we're searching for some topic in a book, we don't just say, oh, geez, I can't find, this is 1,200 pages. It takes a long time to read a book to try to find something. But if you go to the index, on 2 or 3 pages, you'll have all the topics. You say, oh, that's what I'm looking for. That's on page 655. There you are. So this is the same idea. So the idea is that this is some kind of a topic or a key value, and this key value can be associated with many, many properties or attributes that are quite extensive. And you can think of this as, having details about something, about some object number 1988. It just goes on. It could be very, very long. But here, notice that if I go to the index, I have 1988 as the key, and it says if you want to find it, it's going to be at offset 0 in the file. So I go to offset 0, and I'm right at the beginning of that record. So I found it here. The advantage of searching through the index is that the index only contains the key and the location for the record. It doesn't contain all this other information that's difficult to get through. Okay? This may have 4 bytes of key, maybe 4 bytes of offset. That's all you have. But this might have 4 bytes of key and then maybe 2,000 bytes of details or 10,000 bytes of details. So this file is going to be much, much smaller. Okay, and you can see how we can find things. So it's a simple index, and in this case, it's what we call a single level index, meaning that there's only one, we search for one index. Once we find what we're looking for, we go to the location that's specified on the index. If we don't find it in the index, it's not there. So the index has to have every entry in the file has to be in the index. And we call that a dense index. A dense index has every entry in the file has to be in the index. So how big could this file be? Well, for example, what if I had 10 million records? Then if I have 10 million records, it's going to be 10 million of these things. Each of them, let's say it's 1,000. Well, 10 million times 1,000 is going to be what? 10 million times 1,000. Nobody knows? What's a million times 1,000? A billion, right? So 10 million times 1,000 is going to be 100 million. Okay, so the file becomes large, or even a billion. So if it becomes a gigabyte-sized file, what about this? Well, if you have 1 million records, then this is only going to have 8 million bytes. Because 4 and 4 times a million is going to be 8 million. It's very small. So an index file is usually a lot smaller than the file we're actually looking into. Okay, but this can still keep increasing. What if we have 100 million records? Then this becomes 800 million, close to a billion. This index becomes large too, difficult to search, difficult to look through. So the index itself. So what we'd like to do is some technique that's going to allow us to get through an index as quickly as possible, even if the file is very, very large. So we go into something known as a multi-level index. A multi-level index is an index that you enter the index at one level, and then you keep progressing deeper into the index until you have a location where what you're looking for is actually stored. So multi-level index, such indexes add depth to a flat index. And a flat index is pretty much what we were looking at in the other example. Flat meaning that this is just like one-dimensional. You go from here, you have to go immediately to here, so you go one-dimensional. Each higher level to the index is an index at a lower level. So a multi-level index, upon the first level of the index, you have information about how to get to the second level. And if you have a third level, the second level has information how to get there. Once you get past the third level, usually you can go directly to the location of the file. Now, the other good thing about the multi-level index is that the location of the first level, or the size of the first level, is much, much smaller. So the index actually is very, very tiny at the first level. It gets a little bigger and gets a little bigger. But it never gets as big as the entire index for a flat or one-dimensional index. So the dense index is an index where every record has an entry, and a sparse index is only a fraction of the records are in the index. Yet we can find all of them. So which one would make more sense to have for space?
Sparse index.
Sparse index may be the best choice. The only thing you can't get from a sparse index, if you wanted to look at the index to determine in a sparse index whether an element is in the file, you can't do it with a sparse index. Because a sparse index will say, look in the file here. And if it's not there, it's not there. If it's there, it's there. But unless you go in the file, you can't determine whether it's there or not because it's a sparse index. So it'll tell you where it's going to be. And if it's not there, it's not there. But you still have to make that last check. With the dense index, you can actually determine from the index whether something is in the file or not. Okay, so indexes are good for providing fast access to records. They're not so good sometimes at sequential access, one key after another. And then we're going to look at something called a blocking factor. The blocking factor is, well, what is a blocking factor? We're going to divide our records into two pieces. One is going to be called what we call a physical record, and one is called a logical record. The logical record is essentially what we think of as the data or the information about a particular item or element. The physical record is something to do with the way the operating system is using memory to store things. So for example, operating systems typically have what we call blocks. And those blocks are used for transferring memory from, let's say, the disk into our RAM. So that's called a block or a blocking factor. Sometimes we call them pages. Have you heard of those things from operating systems? Okay, so you may know that for example, let's say Windows operating system has physical pages that are fixed in size. Do you know how big they are? Anybody?
4 MB or something.
That's too big.
So if it KB something KB.
So typically Windows, we have a block size or page size of 4K. That is the smallest amount of bytes that Windows is going to allocate for a file, and it also may be one of the smallest pieces of memory that it's going to transport from secondary memory to primary memory. So when you need something from secondary memory, and you specify the location of what you want, and let's say you're only looking for 4 bytes, the operating system will never move 4 bytes for you. What they'll say, okay, what is the page that this thing is part of? and they'll move the entire page into memory. And the reason for that is because we have seen through lots of experimental work and analytical work is that if you move a piece of memory by request, it's very likely that the adjacent memories are also going to be needed to be accessed. Okay? So therefore, moving the neighbor memory into RAM, which takes a long time because you have to go through a very slow secondary memory, which has 1/1000th of a second comparable speed, because it's a millisecond speed, it's maybe a magnetic large disk, and you're moving into memory that's going 1,000,000 times faster, which is nanosecond speed, which is RAM and cache memory. So if you're going to make the big investment of moving something from a very, very slow memory to a big memory, you might as well make a big chunk, because you don't have to pay the big price again when it's very likely that you're going to want to access the next memory very, very soon. So the blocking factor basically is the number of logical records that we can fit into a physical block. So logical records into a physical block. So for example, if the block size is 2,000 bytes, roughly 2K or something like that, or it could be 4K, and the index size is 10 bytes, then our blocking factor for this one is going to be 2,000 divided by 10 is going to be 200. So the blocking factor for the index is 200. That means to each physical block, you can put in 200 pieces of information about the index. If the data record is 100 bytes, then the same block only gives you 20. Does that make sense? If the data record say is 1,000 bytes, which is close to K, then our blocking factor would go down to what?
2.
2. So that's why this isn't going to be important. So that's blocking factor. So let's look at a situation here where we're going to assume that the blocking factor for the data, which is here, is 1. That means that one block contains one record. One physical block, one logical record. So let's say the number of logical records is 1,000,000. Oh, yes?
So how do you calculate the blocking factor?
I don't. I'm just giving it to you. So I'm just giving it to you. So since I have 1,000,000 logical records, and the blocking factor for the data is 1, I will have 1,000,000 physical records. Makes sense, right? Okay, so now, if we look at the blocking factor for the index, we're going to say the blocking factor for the index is 100. What does that mean? It means that a block of this size contains one piece of data, but a block of the same size contains 100 index entries. Why? Because they're tiny. Because they're very, very small. So therefore, I will have 100 entries here, 100 entries here, etc., etc., etc. And what I have is I have a dense index of 1,000,000 entries. The number of physical blocks here is 1,000,000, but the number of physical blocks here is what?
100.
It's going to be 10,000. Whoops. 10,000, right? That's the answer. I was hiding it from you. The answer is going to be 10,000 because the blocking factor is 100. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go, so this is now the level of the index closest to the data. Now we're going to go one level higher on this multi-level index. And what I'm going to do, so there are 10,000 pages here, correct? Now, for each of those pages that are here, I only will take the maximum value and put it here. So 222 represents 100 values. 387 represents the next 100 values. So basically, the number of pages from this level of the index, when we go to here, goes from 10,000 down to?
100.
Goes to 100. So now we have 100 pages. Okay? And then finally, we have 100 of these pages, so we only need one at the top level index. So top level index has only one page. Now, what's a page? Well, a page is basically some multiple of k. Again, we can say 4k, 2k, 1k, some kind of k. Again, it has to do with how much memory do you want to transfer from the file system to the primary memory. So, this thing, this index, this highest level of the index is actually very, very small. So so it is going to be part of the file, but what we can do is we can basically keep that in memory all the time. As we keep it in memory all the time, then the amount of access to secondary memory, if we keep this in memory, is just going to be, very quickly we'll go to here, and to here. So we'll only have to have 2 secondary memory access on this level of the index, this level of the index, and finally to get the data. Does that make sense? So we're trying to minimize the access. Now, if you thought about the original index, if this had, for example, 10 million entries, then also this, which would be another file, would have some kind of blocking factor. The blocking factor could be 10. Okay? So if it was 10, then, and you had, let's say, a million of them, so you'd still have 10,000 pages. So you might have to go through, on average, half of those 10,000 pages to find what you're looking for. What does that mean? It means you have to say, okay, I want the first page, you get 100 of them, you get the next page, the next page, the next page, now I found what I'm looking for. So, and since there are going to be so many of these pages, you're on the average going to be looking through half of them, just to get to the location, or to determine that what you're looking for is not there. But in this example, notice that once I put this in memory, all I have is 1, 2 accesses, and then the third one, and here we go. And that's to access 1 million records. Okay, so you can see that multi-level indexing makes sense. And now we're going to look at a slightly different example.
Would that be big O of n over 2?
Well, n over 2 is n.
Okay, is that?
N over 2 is just n, sure. So now, let's say our blocking factor for data, which was initially 1, let's say our blocking factor changes to 10. Okay, why did it change to 10? That means I only have 10 records in a block. I don't know why. Maybe it's a different block size. Maybe the memory is 1/10 the size of the previous one. So maybe if the block is 4K, and you now have 10 of them, so maybe you have 4K divided by roughly 10. So 4,000 divided by 10 will be 400, so the record is smaller. Maybe the block is bigger, some combination. The bottom line is the blocking factor of the data has changed to 10. The blocking factor of the index is still 100, because it's the same, it doesn't really change much, right? So in this case, so I guess we have to assume that the records are smaller here, because we can fit more of them into the same block, but the index records are the same, so we can still get 100. So the number of logical records, meaning number of these logical records, is going to be 1 million. But the number of physical blocks is what? It's no longer 1 million, now it's going to be 100,000. 100,000. So how many of these are we going to have now? Here's the answer. So 100,000, reduce it by 2 orders of 10. So 10,000, and then finally 1,000. Then you're going to go down to 10. Then you're going to be at 1. Okay? So if you look over here, let's go to the previous page again. I'm going to go in the right direction. Here we go. So here, the total size of the index. Total size of the index, how many blocks does it have? Well, it's going to have 10,101 blocks. So 10,101. That's the size of the index in our first case. In our second case, our index is going to be 1,011. Okay? So because we started here with 100,000, so we only had 1,000, 10, and 1. So this index is a lot, it's really, really tiny. Okay? All right, so now we're going to look at sort of the general idea of what we've been looking at. So this whole idea of a multi-level indexing is really, has been formalized and made very, very well developed by the invention of the B tree, which you can see were invented a long, long time ago. And the B tree, or sometimes the B plus tree, which is the relative of the B tree, are typical implementations of search trees for locating things as quickly as possible. And the B trees were developed primarily to minimize the levels of a search index, also known as a search tree. And so how many of you have studied B trees in database, for example? Should be almost everybody, right? If you took a database course, you take database? Not yet?
Next semester.
Okay. So you'll see a little bit what we're talking about. And essentially, there's a small difference between a B tree and a B plus tree. And I'm going to try to make it as obscure as possible, but I will still tell you what the difference is. It is a significant difference, but primarily B plus trees are extensions of B trees that can be used in databases for sequential access. That's all I'm going to say. All right, so now, whenever you have a B tree, you have an order of the tree. And the order of the tree is the maximum number of children you can have. So if M, which is the B tree order, is equal to 3, that means that one node can have up to 3 children. Okay? And so the way I'm going to implement it is, you can see here, if I have to insert into this B tree of order 3 a K, F, and a G, I can put the K, the F, and the G, and they can all fit in here comfortably because there are 3 of them in there. Okay? So what I'm really doing here, in this case, I'm really kind of doing a B plus tree, but you'll see why in a moment what that's all about. Now, the requirements for a B tree of order M is that we have a minimum of 2 children and a maximum of M children. Minimum of 2, maximum of in this case, 3, when M is 3. And if you are any other node than the root, then you have a ceiling of M over 2 children and a maximum of M children. The maximum is the same, but the minimum is different. Except that in a B tree of order 3, it's actually not the same. It's not different, rather, because 3 over 2 is 1.5, and the ceiling of that is 2. So therefore, M over 2 ceiling, when M is 3, is the same thing as 2 to M, 2 to M. So what makes this tree special, a B tree of order 3, is that all the nodes essentially have the same characteristic in terms of how many children they can have. Okay, and this tree, specifically, when you have a B tree of order M, it's referred to as a 2-3 tree. Probably because of the 2, 3, 2, 3. Okay, so it's a special, so a 2-3 tree is a B tree with some special properties. What's significant about a B tree? What's significant about a B? Anybody know can tell me what has special significance about a B tree? The special significance is the B tree is a tree which is always balanced. Always. It's never unbalanced. And unlike most trees which grow downward, the B tree actually grows upward when it needs to. So it's kind of like the way we did our analysis for the different shapes of trees, where we basically said, okay, if you're a tree of order 25, then the subtrees have 24, and you're at 25. So we kind of put this one on top of it, so it's the 24, and now all of a sudden it's 25. Well, in the same fashion here, we're going to have a tree which, when it becomes full, and it has a height of 2, it's going to grow a new root and increase to a height of 3. Okay, so I'll show you some basic ideas of how that works. Implementation is a little tricky, but it's not too bad. All right, so you can see that I'm going to insert the sequence of keys, K, F, and G. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have to insert the Y. So when the Y goes in, it overfills the node. And I'm signifying the overfull node by the dotted lines, which means the node cannot be like that all the time. It's temporary. So what's going to happen is the f, g, k, y are temporarily in the node, and then the node will split in half. What's the height of the tree here? 1. Okay, so when this splits, now I'll have two nodes, but I can't have two nodes without a root. So when this splits, I will have to generate a new root. And so what's going to happen is, you can see here, is that the f and the g will split, k and the y will split, and then I will take the maximum key of this one, maximum key of that one, and I put it into the new root, and notice that I still have a balanced tree. Notice that all the values in the tree are appearing in the bottom level. So now I'll make my connection to the B plus tree. So, would you agree that the G points to the values that are G or less?
Yes.
Therefore, it will point to the smallest values in the tree. So therefore, the first is F, and then we have G. And if I had a pointer to the adjacent child here, F, G, K, Y would be the traverse of all the nodes in key order. That's what a B plus tree does. I'm not putting a pointer here, because I don't have any need to do it, but you could put a pointer here. Okay? So now the next thing to insert would be a U. Where's U going to go? Well, U is going to be less than Y, so it's going to go into this node, and this node is fine with the U, because it can hold 3 keys. So after U goes in, R is going to go in. R doesn't go here, R goes here. What's going to happen is R is still going to go into this node, and now with R in there, U goes in. When R goes there, R overfills the node. So what's going to happen is this node is going to split. KR, UY, the Y is already up there, it's going to shift, and the R is going to go in between, and now we have a tree. Notice the tree has grown another node at the leaf level, but it has not changed its height. Okay? So that's what we have here. So we have G, R, Y. After R, we're going to insert W, P, and L. So W and P are trivial, because W can just go in here, there's space for it, and P can go here. When we go to L, L is going to want to go here. And when L goes here, we're going to have an overfull node here. And that overfull node, when that overfull node is full, it's going to have to split. So this node is going to split. And now R is already up there, so we're going to send L up there. But after that happens, notice that I have 4 children here, or 4, I can't have that. So what's going to happen is this node is going to split. So GL is going to split, taking its 2 children on the left. RY is going to split to the right, and then I will grow a new root node, which will have what keys in it? L, Y. Okay? So you see what happens here? So now I have, notice my B tree continues being balanced. Okay. So now what I'm going to insert V, X, and D. So where's V going to go? V is going to want to go here, here, and here. Right? So what's going to happen here? UV, WY will split. Again, keep in mind, if I have a pointer to the leftmost child, and that one had pointers across the same level, I would have access to the key order. F, G, K, L, P, R, U, W, Y. That's the B plus tree that we're not using, but it could be. So V goes in, and V creates this split here, and then D goes in. D is fine. D goes in, not a problem. So now we have this situation. So now let's say the next thing we want to do is we want to delete some nodes. To delete a node, you try to just delete it and see if that's okay. So if you have to delete X, that's no problem, is it? What if you want to delete Y? It's not a problem, but because Y is the maximum key, you really need to go to your parent and to change it and say, hey, now the maximum is going to be X, and then go up and see if that Y appears, just repeat it. Okay, so that's fine. So deleting X is very, very easy. Let's say we want to delete G.
Professor,
delete-
why is it called as 2, 3, tree?
2, 3 tree?
Yeah, why is it called as 2?
That has to do with the fact that the root has from 2 children to m children. But m is 3, so it's 2 or 3. Every other node has between m over 2 ceiling function children to m. But m over 2 ceiling is 1.5 ceiling, which is 2. M is 3, so 2, 3.
So minimum of 2 and maximum of 3, you mean?
For the 2, 3 tree, which is a special case of the B tree, which tells us that we're definitely going to be looking at the more general case of the B tree.
It could be 2 or 5, could be...
It could be 512
Yeah.
So in this case, 2 minimum and 3 maximum children here.
for any node. Notice that, yeah, and if you notice it initially, notice that what happened was we had a root, right? And when we grew another level, notice that the root immediately had how many children? Can't have 1. So 2, 3 tree, immediately had 3, yes.
Because we are trying to implement B tree, right? So why, like when there's an overflow, it should only be the middle element that should be raised, right? Because in B plus tree, it is the thing like all the values, like the data elements are at the leaf node, are at the same level,
Yes.
bottommost. And the layers above that has the pointers to the same level, right?
Yes?
But here you're raising like 2 elements, like the, because we have 4 elements there. So overflow is on 4 elements. So you're raising the second and the 4th element there.
I don't know what you mean by
Second
second and
is the
fourth.
Second element.
What do you mean by second and the fourth? I'm not sure what you're talking about.
I mean L and Y.
L and Y being the second and the fourth. Okay.
It should only be L, right? Because what we try to implement is like when we raise L, the elements which are less than L would be on the left, greater than
There are
L.
many different implementations, right. You could have an implementation less than or equal to and greater than, left and right. Absolutely. You could do it that way.
I mean, on what basis you have raised 2 elements up? L and Y.
L and Y. Say again?
On what basis you have chosen L and Y to raise up?
Well, right now, this is pointing to a subtree where the maximum key is L. So we'll go here, and this is pointing to a tree where the right subtree is maximum L.
Can you please go to previous slide?
Yes? Here? Okay, so?
So here G, L, R and Y you have. I mean, you're raising L and Y on what basis here?
Which one? Which one
In
again?
G, L, R, Y.
I don't see
No,
L.
the last one.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Here, I mean, what you're looking at, the maximum you mean here, Y is
Well, this
maximum.
is a temporary state, because this node is splitting, right? This node already split into these two, because we added L, so the node split. And then what happens since it split, and R was already in there, so the L becomes a new max, so L is promoted here, which causes this one to split, which then now is going to create a root of Ly. That's where we are here. This is just one implementation of the B tree. This is one implementation. There are different ways of implementing it. This is one of
Can we
them.
follow the other one? Only
Huh?
raising one.
We're going to look at another one. Just for you.
So the remaining nodes, they are also data nodes or they are pointer nodes there? Because it's going to be duplicates, right? Because you're raising Y over there. Because in B tree, usually all the nodes are like the data nodes, right? So
In this case, you could think of these bottom ones as being the ones that have the pointers. So these, okay, so what you can do is you have to go like, look at this like this, and then if you go like this, then think of this as the first level of the index. Kind of like a multi-level index. So if this turns 90 degrees, then you're going from the first level of the index to a second level, to a third level, then you're going to the data. So you can think of this bottom level as the one closest to the data. It's going to have all that information.
So if you want to search for Y, you go from the root node to Y that way.
You're searching for Y. Yes, you're going to search for Y until the node has no more children. You have to go to the leaf level to get it.
But then it would be similar to the B plus tree, right? Because that implementation is usually done in B plus.
Yes.
So then what's between D and B plus over here?
Well, this is more of a B plus 2-3 tree. Okay? Kind of a little bit of a hybrid. Okay. If we want to delete a G, so let's go back to see where we are. So we have a G. Where's the G? Can we delete the G? Yes? We delete the G, but it's the maximum, so we have to change this to a F. But since F is not the biggest, we don't have to go any higher. If we're deleting L, that'd be a different story. So now we're going to delete the G, and that's fine. So we can simply remove from the leaf. How would we delete Y? If we delete Y, we can still delete Y, right? But it's the maximum, so we have to go up here, still the maximum, so we have to change it to X, still the maximum, we have to change it to X. Let's delete V. V is going to be a problem for us, right? V is going to be a problem. Why is V a problem?
Because then U, P, and R can be in the same node.
The problem is going to be that in this implementation, we cannot have a single value in a node. It's a 2-3 tree, so it's going to be two or three key values, 2 or 3 children. Okay, 0 or 2 or 3. So therefore, if we delete V, what's going to happen is you're going to have 1 here, but you're going to have 3 here and 2 here. So what's going to happen is we're going to actually take this W and move it over to here. So W takes the place of the V, becomes the maximum, so then we change it over here, V becomes W, and our tree is intact. So what we're doing basically is we're sharing the children. So the children of this node can be shared to establish new nodes, as long as there's enough children. For 3 children, we need to have 6.
And then W would go
Yes.
replace V.
Okay? So now we're going to delete K. Let's say we want to delete K. You see, this is going to be a problem. You see why it's going to be a problem? If you delete K, again, you're leaving 1. If you had 3 here, then you could shift it this way, but you can't do it. So you're going to delete K, and then what you're going to do is you're going to actually, because you cannot do anything here, you can try to borrow from these other children here, but you have nothing extra left over here. So what you can try to do is basically you can merge this node. So if you want to delete the K gets deleted. Okay, K gets deleted from here. And what we can do is now, essentially, we can merge this L together here. And the R, since there's 3 in here but only 1 here, now the R can move over, and we are distributing the children of the root. So this goes to the right to be the parent. So now you have R, and now notice that you have only a single child. That's not acceptable. But you have here a node that has 2 children and actually a 3rd child. So as this becomes a merged node here, this child is adopted by the left parent. And so we're going to have LR as the node and WY as the node. The WY keeps these, and the LR is the parent of this left and this right child. So what's going to happen here is we're going to get this situation. So LR. Okay, now we're going to delete X. So we're trying to do all the bad things we can do, right, to really mess things up. Delete X. If we delete X, then we can really delete this X, but then the problem is we cannot borrow any children here, right? So if we delete X, notice that the only thing we can do, we can merge here. And when we merge here, how many total nodes do we have?
3.
3 nodes. So how many nodes do we need on the next level up? We only need 1. So therefore we can merge these 2. And once we merge these 2, then the root is no longer necessary. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to merge those. So the U, W, Y is merged. And then this node is going to have these two are going to merge. It's going to be L, R, and Y. The W is no longer necessary because Y is coming over here. So we'll have L, R, and W. L, R, okay? And now, or Y rather, I should say. So now these nodes, the three nodes, we merge L, R, and Y in here. And now what we have is we have the root, which only has one child. That's not acceptable. Once you have one child and you're a root, you're no longer a root. So the tree is now shrinking from the root. And it goes from a height of 3 to a height of 2. Get the idea? All right, now, you probably noticed that there was a lot of adjusting and shifting to keep things balanced, right? And anybody know why it happens so frequently? So frequently we were getting taller and getting shorter and shifting. How come?
To make it balanced.
Well, I'd like your answer to include the letter M. M. The reason, can you think of a solution that would allow us to do everything we just did here without a single merging, growing? Can you think of that? We could change it very, very easily if we said, let's let M be 512. Now you have a node that can take 512 keys, say, right? Do you have 512 keys in there? No. We didn't have that many. So you just keep stuffing them in the node and taking them out of the node. It's going to take a long time for that node to fill up. Now, if you had a B tree where M was 512, then the root node could have as few as 2 children and as many as 512 children. So after we got 512 keys into the root, we would still be having a tree with a single node, 512 entries. But if we added one more element into it, it would make it 513. What would happen to the root node? It would split into 256, let's say, and 257. And then we would have a new root, which would point to them. You get the idea? Okay. So if we increase the value of M, we will decrease the amount of modifications or small updates, because the tree will be much more powerful, much more able to grow without too much adjustment. Okay, so let me, before I go to the next topic, I'm going to finish up and give you an analysis of the B trees. So some of you were wondering about that and different implementation of the B tree that's going to come out here. Okay. So this is probably a little bit of a truer implementation of a B tree without being a B plus tree. Okay. So the B tree is a search tree of order M. The order can be as small as 3 or very large like 256 or 512. Now, what happens to the shape of the tree as M is increasing from 3 towards big values like 256 and 512? What happens to the shape of the tree?
It goes hard.
It goes very, 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 very wide, but not very, very
Vertical.
high. And what's the advantage of that?
Faster.
The advantage of that is that if we can read one node, and that one node can be stored in a physical block, and we only need to read 1 or 2 other nodes before we find what we're looking for, we can address an immense amount of search space in a file. Immense. Okay? So it'll be like a multi-level index, but it will be controlled by a very well-defined data structure, which is going to be able to be maintained. So here's an example of an ordinary B tree. This is a 2-3 tree, isn't it? The root has 2 children. It can have as few as 2 and as many as 3. And every other node can have between 2 and 3. Notice that this one has 2, this one has 3. Okay? All right. So the invariant for the B tree is the root is either an empty tree, which is an external node, or it has between 2 and m children. We already know that. And all non-root internal nodes have between m over 2 ceiling and m children. All external nodes, which are null pointers, have the same depth, key set nodes, which makes the tree balanced, always. So the B tree invariant says the B tree analysis is based on the height of the tree and its order. So we are going to let n min, or the minimum n, be the number of nodes in a B tree of height h of order m. Okay? So n min will be the minimum number of nodes. Remember, if the root can have between 2 and m children, then if it has 2, it's 2. Plus the root is 3. But if m is 512, I can have 3 nodes, or I can have 513 nodes. And the tree is still height equal to 2. So the number of nodes for a tree of the same height will vary in a B tree. So therefore, n min will be the minimum, the fewest nodes we can have in a B tree, which has a height of h and an order of m. Does that make sense? So, let's think about the root. The root has a minimum of 2 children. The root has a minimum of 2 children. The internal nodes, are non-root nodes, have a minimum of m over 2 ceiling children and m over 2 ceiling keys. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to do some addition using our sum. And so here is what we call the minimum B tree, height h, order m. So notice that the minimum tree has a root at the top, and it has exactly 2 children. Why? Because that's the fewest it can have. Yeah.
What is ceiling children? Or what are
See what's what?
ceiling children? When you say m over 2 ceiling children?
Oh, ceiling is just rounds it to the next greatest integer. So if you have, so for example, so if let's say m is equal to 7. What's 7 over 2? 3.5. So that would ceiling to 4.
Okay.
That's all it is. Now, if m is an even number, then m over 2 ceiling is equal to m over 2. You don't need the ceiling. The ceiling you really only need when you have an odd number, and certainly a 2-3 tree, we need that. But for large values, we typically will choose m's that are even, so the ceiling is irrelevant. Okay, so here's the root, it has exactly 2 children. But now, once we go to the next level, we cannot have this left child cannot have 2 children. This one must have a minimum of m over 2 ceiling children. Okay? M over 2 ceiling children. What is that? I don't know. If m is 512, that's 256.
We don't know m in this case.
It could be as high as m, but it could be as low as m over 2 ceiling, so we're going to use that. So what I have is the number of nodes starts here at 1. The minimum one has 2 at the next level, but then these 2 have a minimum of 2 times m over 2 ceiling. Does that make sense? So that's the number of we have so far at this level. Now once we have this many, then each of these nodes at level 2 will have m over 2 ceiling again, which will basically start exponentiating this. So it's going to be m over 2 ceiling squared, etc., etc., etc. Notice that when we are at depth 3, it's power 2. Depth 2, it's power 1. Depth h minus 1, it's power h minus 2. Depth h, we're at 0. Why 0? Because the height is h. So that means that this is a height of 1, height of 2, height of h. So here we have 0. There are no nodes here. We're out of the tree. Okay, so what we need to do in order to find out how many nodes we have here, we have to add these together. We have to sum this plus this plus this plus this. And you can see it's basically going to be, this is just going to be 2 times m over 2 ceiling to the 0, plus 2 times m over 2 ceiling to the 1, plus 2 times m over 2 ceiling to the 2, plus 2 times m over 2 ceiling to the h minus 1. So we need to do this summation, and the summation is solved by the geometric series. So we're just adding these, and I am excluding the root, which means that I'm taking this out. It's 1. I will add it later. It's just inconvenient for my summation. So I want 2 times m over 2 ceiling to the power of I. And I, notice that, what's the power of m over 2 ceiling here? 0. 0, 1, 2, all the way down to h minus 2. So I will let my summation go, this is going to be 2 times m over 2 ceiling 0, m over 2 ceiling 1, squared, h minus 2. So what I have, and I can take the 2 out, is 1 plus this plus this plus this plus this. So we can see that there's a ratio, and the ratio is m over 2 ceiling. Okay, so this is a geometric series. The number of terms, this is m over 2, 0. 0 to h minus 2 is h minus 1. So there h minus 1 is the number of terms. So when you simplify this, that 2 comes out here, and we have m over 2 to the h minus 1 minus 1 over m over 2 ceiling minus 1. So this is the number of nodes in a minute. So this tree of order m cannot have any fewer nodes than this. Does that make sense? And the reason I'm analyzing this particular tree is because I want to find out, in the worst case is the tree can't have any fewer nodes. Is this going to give us a good performance for a large index? You understand? So this tree is as least populated tree of height h as is possible. And this is how many nodes it has. So what we're going to do is we are going to plug in some values, and we're going to use a value of m is 512 and h is equal to 4. That means the tree has a height of 4, root, and 1 more, 2 more, 3 more levels on top of the root, or bottom of the root, and m is 512. So when we do that, we end up having 64,000 nodes. 64,000 nodes is the absolute minimum number of nodes we can have in a tree of order 512, height 4. When we take this tree to height 6 with the same m value, the number of nodes increases to 4 billion, 4 GB. This is the absolute fewest we can have. We can't have any less than that. And now what we want to do is we want to consider the number of keys it can have. Because remember, the number of nodes is not the same as the number of keys, because we can have multiple keys within the nodes. So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the minimum number of nodes by the minimum number of keys you can have in those nodes. And that is m over 2 ceiling minus 1. So you can think of basically, if you have 3 children, you're going to have 2 keys. If you have 512 children, you'll have 511 keys. And then you can go to the left of it, in between all the keys, and to the right of the last one, right? So therefore, when we do that, we will get, so this is pretty easy multiplication. Notice that m over 2 minus 1, it's a beautiful cancellation, right? So we get a very simple result. So therefore, we can solve that the n min is equal to this exact value. So therefore, n min, or I don't know if this is n min, but n will be greater than or equal to this result. So that means the actual number of nodes in a tree. How likely is it that the tree will actually be a minimum B tree of order m height h? The answer is probably pretty darn small. That's the minimum. And you'll see how small it's going to be in a second. You'll be shocked how small it is. So now, number of keys, including the root, and the number of keys in n, it's still sticking with the minimum tree. When m is 512, h is 4, we now have approximately 32 million keys. That means that this tree, which has a height of 4 and an order of 512, can address around 32 million records. Now, if you don't think that's a lot, think about each record being a K. So if you have 32 million, now it's 32 gigabytes file. With 32 million records, each of them is a K size. So 32 million records which you can address. When you increase the height of the tree to 6, you can now address 2 tera of records when you plug it into the formula. Tera is trillion, so 2 trillion. And we can easily get to the next levels, which is 1,000 trillion is a peta. That's our next number that we're going to be favoriting. We'll say how many petabytes our drives have, how many exabytes, zettabytes, yottabytes it has. So each of this is increasing by a power of 1,000. So peta is 1,000 teras. An exa is 1,000 petas. A zeta is 1,000 exas, and a yotta is 1,000 zetas. So these are very, very large numbers. These are numbers you may encounter in your lifetime and say, yeah, I know. I heard that first here. I hope to. Yeah, I'll have that half zettabyte drive. Okay, so this is pretty remarkable that we have a tree of order 512, height 6, which is as skinny as we can make that tree. We are really killing it by cutting it in half whenever we can. Half and half and half and half and half. And we're still able to have 2 trillion keys. Talk about big data, right? So now we can also, so this is a very, very interesting calculation. Since we have in our calculations the value of h, and h is really embedded here and here, we can actually calculate a maximum height of a tree given its number of keys. So we can solve for h. And so what we have here is we have m over 2 ceiling, h minus 1, is less than or equal to n plus 1 over 2. And we get from here to here, and then we can find that the height of the tree will be less than or equal to log to the base of m2 ceiling. Why? Because that's the exponentiating number, m over 2, that's what it's growing by, of n plus 1 over 2 plus 1. So, let's say when k is equal to 2 to the 45 power, that's 32 tera keys. That's a lot of keys. All we need to do is put that value into our k, and we have h of t is less than or equal to log to 256, which is 512 over 2 ceiling, log 256, 2 to the 45 plus 1 over 2 plus 1. I simplify it, and here I go, and I have 5.5. So I'm going to 32 trillion keys. Notice that here I have 2 trillion keys. I have increased that by 16, and my tree is the same, pretty much. It's no more than 6. Okay, so now you can say, well, so much for skinny trees. What about really full trees that really maximize, So in that case, the analysis becomes even actually a lot easier because you don't have this m over 2 ceiling anymore. So now we have the number of nodes at this level is going to be 1. Now this is a bad picture. I should have m here, not 2 but m, okay, because that's maximum. So since it's always 2 and m, or m over 2 ceilings to m, maximum is always m. So therefore, I have one root node, m children, m squared, m cubed, m to the h minus 1. All I need to do is add all of these, and that will be the maximum number of nodes. And so when I do that, it's simply a geometric series again. It's going to be m to the h over m minus 1. And the number of keys is going to equal to that times m, which is going to give me approximately m to the h. So now, we can see over here, if we look at our m equal to 512, and h is equal to 4, the skinny tree that we just did before had only 32 million keys at a height of 4, but the maximum trees actually gives us 64 billion trees with the same height. That tells us that it's possible to have 32 million records that you're referring to and increase that by 2,000 times, and the tree will not grow an extra level. That is remarkable. So we can grow from 32 million records that we're pointing to 64 billion, and our tree will flatline at 4. Now, the probability that it's going to flatline at 4 is probably unlikely, because that's the maximum you can have. So chances are it might actually grow an extra level, but the worst it's going to be is 5. So we don't even have to really consider getting the height anymore. We had a height of 6 for the skinny tree, and you can see the height of 4 for the skinny tree is 32 million, but then it's very robust, allowing each record, each of the 32 million records, to explode into 2,000 records. Each of them does that. Okay, and finally, we have a ratio of maximum to minimum number of keys for the B tree. And so all I did here is the maximum number of keys over the minimum number of keys gives me this result here. So given 512 and h is equal to 4, we have a maximum number of keys to, so that's exactly the result we found here, which is 2,000. It's 2 to the 11th power. So you can see here, because to multiply this by 1,000, you get 32 billion, and by 2 one more time to get 64 billion. So that's 2 to the 11th power. So the B tree is the ultimate indexing structure. So you can imagine now that you really don't. So why are we talking about indexing and hashing? Because they give us quick data access. Hashing gives us the best access in the best case, theta 1. But if you consider that the B tree can give us access to 32 trillion keys in 5 accesses, and again, keep in mind that I can keep some of these nodes of the index in memory, that 5 can be easily reduced to 3. So that means I can guarantee 3 when my data size is, let's say, 32 trillion keys. I can guarantee these numbers. Hashing can't guarantee that, because if you start going to overflow, you might have to look through blocks and blocks and blocks. Each block is an access. In B trees, when we implement a B tree, each of these lovely nodes is mapped to a physical block. So the physical block is the one that's actually a node. So that means to go through a tree of 5, I'm going through 5, reading of 5 different nodes in different areas of memory at most. And if 2 of those areas are in memory, then at 3 in the worst case for a very, 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 very large data set. You might say, well, how would hashing compare to 30? When I have to store 32 trillion records, how would hashing compare to it? Well, let me tell you, it would be tough to do hashing with 32 trillion records. And I'll tell you why. Because if you did hashing with 32 trillion records, if you want your packing density, and first of all, how big is your file? If you have 32 trillion records and each of your records is a K, then you have immediately gone into what? 32 petabytes. So now you're telling me you want your packing density to be 50%? So that means you need to have 32 petabytes to throw away, just to avoid collisions, right? And the other 32 petabytes you can use for your file. Good luck. So you can see that it's going to have some problems. And, for example, just going through using extraordinarily large files is going to slow the system down a little bit, trying to move through the file and things like that. And what happens if you have the number of records, for example, is 2 million, and you don't know how many records you're going to get, and all of a sudden you get another billion records? Well, if your hash table has not been prepared to take a billion records after it had 2 million records, where are those records going to go?
Overflow.
Yeah, it's more disaster than you can even imagine. It's unmitigated disaster. So the question is, how do we plan for having a very large number of records when we don't even know what we may be getting? Well, with a B tree, you don't really care. Because the tree just basically is so robust. You can hit it with a sledgehammer, the tree is like, out. You know, it doesn't react. Very robust, and it doesn't grow very much. Not like the trees I showed you, the 2-3 trees, they're little baby. They're baby bees. Baby bee trees. They are very, very, susceptible. They're always splitting. But the big bee trees, they're just like, they're working on the same level. You can see why we need to have pointers going across the siblings, and also we need pointers going up to the parents, up to splitting and growing and stuff like that. So there's a little extra overhead for this kind of thing. So what we're going to do next time is we're going to revisit hashing, and we're going to look at one more technique of hashing called extendable hashing. And extendable hashing is a technique where you can handle vast amount of data in a hash table without allocating the hash table. Interesting?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll see you in a second.